Okay, this is going to be Progressive Era Part 1. How far I got on emergence of the U.S. as a world power is about as far as I would in a face-to-face class. Meaning the reason the supplements exist is so I can just pick up and move on when I need to. And it's critically important that you both watch all the instructional videos, the lecture videos, plus well, hopefully all of the supplementary enrichment ones that I post. And also carefully read through the supplements. Okay, if there's a conflict between what I say and what the supplement says, go with the supplement. So the chapter on emergence of the U.S. as a world power goes on pretty far beyond where I left off, but there's just not enough time. Okay, so we're moving on to the progressive era, and I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as I can. You need to read it carefully. I read it again myself last night. It is, as a colleague noted once, very thorough. um, it's like a fog bank to me. It doesn't break down or outline as easily as I would like for it to. Um, it involves a period of time and a culture where, in a way, the country kind of went off the tracks, I would think. So I don't really too much enjoy dealing with it, but uh, I'll try to hit the high points here. There are two possible essay questions on this whole thing, and I'll get to those at the very least. Okay, first of all, what and when was the progressive era? It was a period of time in American history running from probably the 1890s out to about the time of World War I, really about 20 years in its earlier manifestation, when a lot of Americans, particularly middle class Americans, became very concerned about what they perceived as problems in American life, unacceptable conditions of one kind or another, and they became motivated to try to improve those conditions or bring them into line with how they thought things ought to be. Okay, it's referred to as okay, progressive implies progress. Progress means getting better. That gets into some fairly deep philosophical waters, but not right now for that. It's a middle class movement because the people involved were largely middle class people. That probably means very little to you, and we'll see why here in a minute. But they would have thought of American population divided into rough out three classes. You would have a so-called upper class of people who were comfortably or independently wealthy, that sort of thing. You would have had a lower, and that's not a good word at all, but let's say a working class, which would probably include agricultural workers who more or less lived hand to mouth in many cases. The middle class traditionally was merchants, joined later on by what we call the learned professions. Now, polling has told us for quite a while now that virtually all Americans consider themselves to be middle class. I don't have a problem with that. To me, the more classless our society is, the more comfortable I am with it. Dividing ourselves up into classes, nothing really good comes out of that. I don't think conflict or class conflict or the uh, oppressor versus victim model does anything that we want to do. But anyway, uh, the original idea came in the Middle Ages when society was sharply divided into three estates, as they call them. You have your aristocrats who were members of the nobility. If they had a title, that's one thing. If they were kin to someone who had a title, a man would call himself a gentleman. And there were certain things that went with that. And they outranked the peasantry. These were farm workers, usually um, tenant farmers working on the land. So it's about 80% of the population feeding the other 20%. The third estate were the professionally religious. Prior to the Reformation, you had monks, nuns, priests, etc., members of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. That's how it was. Well, by, say, the 12th century, merchants began to appear who are increasingly wealthy, often wealthier than members of the hereditary aristocracy, where do they fit? They don't. They're middle class. They're between the peasantry and the nobility. Well, hence middle class. So the American middle class changed in the last third of the 19th century with the sharp rise in the number of people who had who practiced professions requiring a lot of academic training, more than they used to. You had doctors, you had lawyers, you had engineers, you had people in education, and accountants, people like that, the so-called learned professions, made up by the end of the century the bulk of the middle class. Now, in the supplement, I go into, but really this is just a quick brush up, but it's going to look complicated a little bit. Changes in literacy and journalism that preceded and made possible the rise of progressivism. Read that. Okay? Now, American middle class people in the late 19th century, one more thing I was going to say, as late as the 1950, when the term middle class had a more specific meaning, only about 40% of Americans really were middle class, meaning they were class conscious. Oh, I can't resist this. This is pretty much long gone now, but there was a time when we had sort of unofficial social class uniforms. If you're a professional, we're talking about the men here mainly, then you wear a suit and a tie. That was a uniform that publicized your social rank. All right. My wife and I enjoy watching old Perry Mason episodes. It's your original courtroom drama, and these episodes were shot in the late 50s up to the mid 60s, and I lived through that time. It seems crazy to me. Here's Perry Mason sitting in his office at 9:45 at night, and his collar button is buttoned, his tie is neatly knotted, and his jacket is buttoned. It's like all the time. Crazy. So that's just a little bit of class consciousness. If you're wearing, Carhartt work boots and jeans, something like that, that pegs where you stand on the hierarchy. So I won't take that any further. 19th century problems that worried middle class people and the I don't know why the upper and lower thing is so important, but they're going to lower middle class. These are basically your white collar occupations, sales, management, etc. It seemed like the walls were just closing in. More and more people lived in urban environments instead of rural environments. That's going to be more stressful psychologically. In the workplace, that things keep sort of tightening up on you. If you work in an office, you could remember a time when there was this easy first name informality that prevailed, but increasingly the organizational chart replaces that. And you have to be careful who you talk to and who you don't, and whose head you must avoid going over, and it's who answers to whom, and all, it's all laid out and regimented. The invention of the time clock. That wasn't that. In other words, you clock in, you clock out. I've done that. You may have too. The boss knows when you got there and when you left. You can't just sort of ease in and hope nobody notices or leave a little early. They're going to know about that. And one that was vigorously protested, the cash register, comes along in, as early as the 1870s, I think. And sales clerks had always just considered it a perk, short for a perquisite, privilege of their job. If they need a little extra, they just help themselves to some petty cash. Nobody thought that was wrong. It was just something you got to do. It came with the job. But the cash register takes that completely away. That cash register's got to balance at the end of the day, or somebody above you is going to want to know why. So the cash register. Time and motion studies, efficiency experts. The first efficiency expert was a man named Frederick W. Taylor. And he does these, and he and his disciples, he trained many of them, time and motion studies. So if you work in a factory, you're a lab worker in a factory, you got these guys snooping around with their clipboards and their stopwatches. They're analyzing everything that's done and breaking everything down into the smallest possible task. And when they're through, you're going to be doing the same little thing over and over and over and over and over and over 10, 12 hours a day till your brain's ready to explode. But it's more efficient. There you go. So pressures are gathering. The problem that scared people the most was the huge growth in the size of businesses, the enormous monopolistic trusts, put air quotes around that, arose by the end of the century, and that scared people. It was a problem of scale, all right? If you lived in a city, we'll cast you as a woman now. You're a housewife. Your job is preparing meals and all of that. And you knew the people you dealt with. This is back in former times, before the big businesses. You got your bread from the baker and your meat from the butcher and the fish from the fishmonger, and somebody else sold vegetables, and you knew all these people by name, and they're going to inquire about how your kids are doing and all of that. And if you got a problem, it's their problem too. But gradually that's gone. By the end of the century, we had our first grocery store chain that was thriving with over 900 stores. They may still be around, I don't know. Referred to as the A&P stores. That stood for Atlantic and Pacific. The A&P store had a much wider variety of merchandise. There was canned, packaged foods with brands and labels and all of that. And you don't know where they came from. They came from one corporation buying from another, and they've got the brand, and they've got a huge market, and the stuff is not always safe. Particular problem would be getting, there's an infectious disease you can get when canned food is not done in a proper way. Salmonella. It's salmonella. By the way, you can can anything and call it anything and it'll be legal. If there's a problem, that's nobody's problem but yours, because the grocery store is not responsible. They bought it from the wholesaler, and the wholesaler is not responsible because they bought it from whoever, all the way back to some corporation that handles all this, where ownership and management are separate. There's nowhere you can go. You're helpless. So time was, you're here and the business is here, and now you're here and the business is here. And you just don't weigh in the balances. So it had to do with food. It had to do with medicine. What we call over-the-counter medicines used to be called patent medicines, because whoever cooked them up probably took out a patent on them. And until about 110 years ago, less than 120, you could package anything, call it anything, claim anything about it, sell it to anybody, and it's all legal. So patent medicines often made outrageous claims of what they would do, and they ranged from the harmless to the dangerous. A couple of the more favored ingredients were alcohol and cocaine. And there's danger here. So that's scary too, and that's among the first things that will be federally regulated, the production thereof. So the rise of big business was scary. So we're going to move on in the next part to the diversity of criticism. Make sure you read the supplement, particularly about how Americans relieved the stress, how urban Americans blew off steam with the rise of large-scale spectator sports, college football, boxing, baseball, professional baseball, late in the 19th century. All of that comes along. Basketball was invented by a man sitting at a desk in the year 1893. Read about that. Okay, be back in part 2.